a thought leadership program that we put in place very recently in January, where we bring the best in the field together and to share their knowledge. And it has been a wonderful, wonderful event. This is the third one. The last one was held a month ago, and we looked at policy. How do you design, formulate, and then implement policy? Do you, for climate change, do you do it from the top down? Do you do it from the bottom up? How is it shaped? What results do we get? All that you will need to check out the recording of that event from last year. So from last month. So this month we just digging deeper into teacher education and how to develop content. And it's all about not only the practice, but what we learned. So I'm really absolutely delighted to introduce Riley. Riley Justis is the CEO of Take Action Global. If you have not met Riley yet, you're in for a ride. He's the most brilliant. He's a brilliant CEO, but he's a brilliant thinker and a real educator. You know, it's not just blah, blah, blah. It's the real thing. And we learned so much from him. So Riley will take this on. Lauren Simmons, our colleague from Save the Children, unfortunately is sick today. So you see her name, but she's with us in spirit for sure. Riley and Lauren have both developed this presentation for us. Please put in the chat who you are, what you're working on in the space of education and climate change. Do not hesitate to ask questions for Riley. This is what this hour is about: sharing, learning, and talking to each other. So with that, Riley, this is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And just a little housekeeping. Because it will just be me doing the presentation today. Lauren, unfortunately, as Yolande said, is not feeling well today. Please feel free to put in the chat anything that you want more information on, any questions that you have. Happy to jump on that, but I might not see it right away. So if Yolande and Sam can take a look at the chat throughout the presentation, that'd be great. I'd love to come back to those questions at any point, or feel free to stop me, Yolande and Sam, and ask any questions that come up. So I will try to keep an eye on both of my screens, doing the best that I can, but I love the interaction that we'll have today. So Lauren will be missed, but we will have a great time and talk about all of the wonderful things coming up. So let me jump into the presentation here. So thank you, Yolande, for the wonderful introduction. I feel honored to take part with the Green Network on this program. So I am working on this three-part series of the webinars, looking at from policy, kind of the basic ground building, foundational building components, working towards kind of some real-life applications of how we can bring climate education to our classrooms, both in the United States and around the world. And then next month, we'll be looking very specifically at policies in specific states and specific regions and how those implications have impacted education. So as Yolande introduced, my name is Riley Justis. I am the COO of Take Action Global. There's my contact information. Please, please, please feel free to reach out, link me on LinkedIn, look me up on Facebook. I'm happy to connect on anything related to climate action, education as a whole across the world. So very excited to be with you today. My background is in education. I'm a career educator. I've worked from coast to coast, from Alaska to inner city Detroit, where I am currently located here in Michigan. So very excited to be joining you today to talk more specifically about climate action education and what we do at Take Action Global to make a difference worldwide with our students and our network and community around the globe. So as I did in the last webinar, I kind of wanted to set the stage the same way in this webinar, because one of the things that we very much found as a core component of the conversation is finding a common understanding of these pieces of language, these individual words around what climate education is. So what we found as we interviewed and surveyed both educators, administrators, and even students around the globe is they wanted a specific common vocabulary around this idea of climate action education, to break down linguistic barriers, to break down ideas, to break these things down and actually allow for additional collaboration. So we talked a little bit about it last month, but here at Take Action Global, we really separate the words. We're talking about climate, we're talking about education, and between those, it's this idea of taking action in your community to how you can impact it locally and globally, this process of climate education. So we're talking about climate, we're talking about what's going on in the world, we're talking about high quality education. If you think about the SDGs, it's SDG number 4, quality education for all, and then taking action as a community of practice around these ideas of education, and specifically climate action education. So I wanted to look back at our previous meeting to talk about some of the things that we kind of highlighted and invite you to actually take part and watch the video related to that. It was a great discussion between Lauren and myself, really tackling these 3 questions. I always try to do these presentations oriented towards questions and impacting the outcomes of the discussion rather than just giving you ideas or giving you the answers. I want you to come away asking more questions. So we really talked about these 3 categories. We talked about global impact, where education and climate education specifically are being introduced around the world. There's some great examples from different countries, different states, and different regions of introducing climate education into the core curricular models. So we talked about some of those. I call them lighthouses, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. But this idea that these are the pinnacle projects or pinnacle programs that we can all look towards and learn from in our growth and development in this process. The second question that we really talked about was system readiness. Are we ready to bring climate education to our educational infrastructure? Are we ready to implement policy into our practice? And are we talking about this in the way that we are trying to bring just a new standard? Or are we trying to bring high quality teaching and learning practices to our classrooms through more effective pedagogy? And then the final component is the ongoing question that we run into in climate education, this idea of measuring outcomes. It's the old adage of what gets measured gets done, the oldest approach in education, and thinking about more specifically how we measure climate education and the impact of climate education in our classrooms around the globe. So I'm very excited to talk about those and bring those to practice today in both how we're measuring, but also how we're implementing climate education in the classrooms. So that's where we were. That's where we kind of jumped off. And before I jump into my next slide and really talking about the big picture, my background is in education and storytelling. I own a bookstore, if you didn't know. So I love talking about the stories. And I wanted to share a little story that I experienced in my last week being on spring break with my kids. So we went to a beautiful location. And if you've ever been to Hawaii, it's absolutely gorgeous. We went to a place called Kualoa Ranch. So Kualoa Ranch is about 30,000 acres of beautiful, pristine Hawaiian countryside. And what they did in this area was they worked collectively. The native Hawaiian population worked collectively to develop something because they saw a need. They saw a need to feed their families, to feed their communities, and really interact in those areas together. So what they did, and I'll show you a picture by the end of this presentation, is they really came together and they looked at a basin right along the ocean front. And they built a wall. They built what we call a retaining wall. This wall is made of volcanic stones that they linked together, but they did something very specific with this work. They left little holes about the size of a quarter in those walls. It allowed the ocean water to come in, so the salt water to come in, and the fresh water coming down from the mountains to interact in those basins and fill them up. So they filled up with what we call brackish water. So it was salty, but also fresh. And what they knew from that experience that they had natively and culturally is that water would allow things to grow really, really quickly. And what they saw with those small holes is all of those plants and animals growing in that brackish water would draw fish in through those small holes. They would eat and eat and eat. The fish would grow larger. And then what they created was what we call a fish pond, where this idea of growing these fish in these community areas made fishing much easier, made all of these impacts much better for the community. But what we didn't see at the time, and they knew, was that it would take approximately 70 years, 70 years, for the fish to grow big enough, for the ecosystem to be sustainable, and really make a difference in the ways that they lived and they worked in those communities. So the impact that they were making was not for themselves. It was not even for the next generation. It was for 2 generations in the future. They were looking forward to the generations that were coming beyond them to really provide back. And I'd like to link that whole idea back to this idea of climate education, where we're not doing necessarily all of these things for today. We're not even doing them for tomorrow. We may be doing them for generations down the road when we're talking about climate education and high quality educational processes. So that's my little story for the day. So when we're talking about climate education and we're talking about educational policy in general, we see kind of this progression. I numbered these 1 through 4 in kind of this system of approach, where we really look at policy as the starting point. We talked in our last meeting that policy can be from the top down, state legislators setting this policy, setting these expectations, or it can be from the bottom up, where we're really setting local policy, looking at schools and the way we're teaching and learning. So we look at this as the starting point for implementation of climate education. All different states, different countries, different locales are at a different point in this process. And we can find some really good examples of those across the globe. But we really start with a policy setting standard. Then we move into standards. So we look at what we're teaching. So we want to see what we want to learn. Then we transition to what we're actually learning in the classrooms or teaching and learning in the classrooms. How are we aligning the work that we're focused on or the content that we want to be instructed, aligning those to the standards process? So how are we making those things work, bringing them effectively into climate education, tailored to fit all of the different areas? So we work with educators around the globe to really implement climate education into all standard areas. It's not something specifically isolated for the science classroom or for the social studies classroom or the more traditional areas that you see climate and climate history really implemented. We want to see this across the board, across all standard areas, and across all content areas, and how we can bring that into the classroom more effectively. One of the things, and the thing that we focus on at Take Action Global, is kind of the number 3 and number 4 here. Highly focused and effective professional development. So that's what I mean by PD, is this idea of professional development. We want to engage these communities in continuous learning. We want to work with teachers. We want to work with students. We want to work with community leaders and other organizations to really bring them together through this idea of continuous learning, to really focus on professional learning and how we can implement more effective practices in the classroom. And as we back up at Take Action Global and really see how these processes are working, we look at the foundation of our professional development as high quality teaching practices rather than focusing first on climate practices. Because when we're implementing high quality pedagogy, it really allows us to use climate as the lens through which to really teach and bring these processes forward. And then finally, impact. This is kind of the last phase. We're looking at how we're impacting the process, how students are learning, what they're learning, what they feel that they can take forward in that process. So going back to my example story, it's looking at what we're impacting not just today, not just tomorrow, but maybe a year down the road, maybe 10 years down the road. And that's one of the difficulties we run into with climate education is we may not be able to see the results like we do on a math test or on a science test. We may have to look further down the road or look into the community in a different way to really measure impact in the system through this system-wide approach, focusing on project-based learning and those outcomes that we can see from that process. So we have some new questions. So I come back to this whole idea of questions. And I love this mechanism of thought, that we really want to look at these as questions and say, hey, this is a problem that we're running into as educators, as leaders, as activists and environmentalists, and really take a look at what we need within this space. Excuse me. So when we're doing this, we wanted to really approach this idea of climate education from a holistic lens. We took a look through our surveys, through our research, through our work with educators around the globe to really understand deeply what environmental education looked like currently, and then what it could look like in the future. What did these individuals need? What did teachers need? What did school leaders need? And what did students want in those conversations? The second, we really talked about a theory of change. So what do we have as a current reality of our program that is not reflecting sustainability education or programmatic needs within our classrooms and school communities? And then finally, bringing about the whole aspect of human-centered design. We wanted to bring it to the forefront of the classroom in sustainability education, but also the core foundational components of instructional design, bringing the human back to the center of those conversations. So we'll approach each of these today, really talking through this process and learning about how we can approach climate education more effectively in the classroom. So when we talk about these concepts in action, we really broke these down into a couple different areas. I highlighted a little bit around the research idea. Considering the most current studies, looking at student and teacher voice around climate sustainability, we really wanted to ask what kind of components were being done in the classroom. What types of sustainability practices were being done, and how do we approach these processes individually? And one of the questions that kept coming up is this idea of imposter syndrome. This idea that I, as a math teacher, don't feel capable or don't feel empowered to be able to teach the concepts of climate action, of climate education in my classroom. So we try to address this in really building that foundation of understanding that climate education or sustainability education is not something specific for you as a climate scientist or a science teacher. This is something that can be done through high quality education in every subject area. We wanted to build the identity of the teacher and really take a look at how we can build those components to support future developments along this idea. And this is not something that's unique to climate education. What we found in our research is that anytime you push an educator outside of their standard area, they feel uncomfortable. They feel that they're not skilled in the ways that they need to be able to approach this in their classrooms. And we need to be able to support them as educational leaders, as researchers, as thought leaders in this field, to be able to support them around this idea of climate sustainability education in their classrooms and be able to give them some of those foundational resources and skills that then they can bring to the classroom. So we talk about activities, we talk about resources, we talk about different opportunities in technology and educational technology to bring to the classroom. All of these things really help facilitate the conversation around high quality teaching and learning practices and how we can bring those into our teaching and learning every single day. The other component is really this idea of learner responsiveness. So we wanted to make sure that we're reflecting the needs of the students to empower the teachers in the instructional design process. So it's something that we as an organization have not approached this as a out-of-the-box solution. Here's a prepackaged solution that you should teach from A to B to C. Rather, we want to empower you as an educator to really approach this model as the expert in the field. We want to look at your needs through the research and say, how do we empower you? And then empower you to actually make those instructional decisions in the development of a curriculum that meets your students' needs, your community needs, things that are flexible and yet responsive in the same way. So we want to look at those as kind of a progressive learning opportunity. We want to approach this as you're building that foundation again and building upon that different resources, different skills not only in you as an educator, but also the students that they can take forward with them. So we work with teachers all over the world to really develop this identity of who they are as an educator, what is their mission, what is their teaching methodology. All of these different components really inform the practice around teaching and learning through climate action and through sustainability education as a whole. So when we did this research, and this study is linked in the PowerPoint deck, and I invite you to read the white paper. It's really interesting. As we looked at educators all over the globe, we found some key themes that kind of popped out at us. And a couple of them I've already talked about. The inconsistency in education or climate education terminology creates barriers to collaboration. So if I'm saying climate education, you're saying sustainability education, others are saying climate action education, it creates this inconsistency in the language that we're sharing and the conversations we're having with each other. So we need to really take the lead as thought leaders in this field to really have the conversation about how we can push the barriers or push the theme, the idea, the definition of this terminology to make a common language in that we can really share across borders. So when we found that teachers have control, they can overcome those challenges, but they need help to go further. So when we're introducing these ideas, these tough concepts, and these tough interactions, that students and teachers have the ability to overcome the challenges. They're best suited to meet the needs of those instructional environments. But what they need is support. They need support from their leadership. They need support from their school administration. They need support from their local and state governments and beyond, because they really need the support and time to make sure that they can impact their students in a positive way. As I said, educators need more support from local and national policymakers to really understand the challenges of the classroom, to say, how are we meeting these needs most effectively? They want to look at innovative approaches to motivate students and young people. And this is where we've really seen the introduction of educational technology be used in very, very effective ways. Because it allows us to look at a new theme or a new concept and approach that from a new angle or a new way of thinking and give them the voice, give them through the human-centered design model, this idea that they can lead the challenge. If we have a preset outcome, oftentimes we're hindering the process of that educational progression, where if we give a general idea of where we want them to go and then empower the student or empower the learner to really meet those needs through an approach that is reflective of their own interests, we see an increase in motivation. We see an increase in aptitude. We see an increase in interest in that whole area. And then finally, parents in the wider community play such a key role around this idea of supporting climate education, because climate education or sustainability education is something that is so important as a community. It's something that impacts all of the people in the community. It's not just the school, and it's not the responsibility of the school to fix the community. So we have to engage parents. We have to engage community leadership. We have to look at this from a different angle. So an interesting experience we've had here in the United States related to this is we've met with local governments and we've met with school officials, and both say those issues are a school issue or those issues are a local government issue. They don't necessarily work together. Well, both of them are part of that community and working with the same population of learners, but also adults. We want them to really feel empowered to work together and engage this as a community interaction, a community support component. So this is just a little quote. Adequate training of climate education is how best it can be integrated in a curriculum. Access to relevant agencies, organizations committed to the same goals for collaboration and outreach and projects. A blueprint for actualizing climate education is key. So as we get kind of in the next step, is this idea of the theory of change. So where are we at? Where do we want to go? And how do we get from point A to point B? So we're going to do this through a couple different components. First one is really talking about outcome action planning, that we want to collectively define educational programming around sustainability and what it should look like in a K-12 classroom. What do we want students to learn? One of the big questions that comes up with this is who's responsible for defining that? Is that a problem of the classroom teacher? Is that the problem of the state or local government, the administration, or the student themselves? And that is not only a challenge, but also an opportunity, because nobody has necessarily defined what we want them to learn, what we want students to learn or communities to achieve through this model. We have the opportunity right now to get out in front of that and really take a look at what we want students to learn, the skills that we want them to develop, these 21st century skills, the green job skills, all of these things is really right now having this conversation about how we can impact classrooms in the most effective way. And make sure that we are meeting those needs. But we can do that through that reverse engineering process of what are we looking at as a collective, and then how can we build that model to really meet those needs. So when we're looking at our community, something that may impact your community, that is the outcome that we want to address. So whether it's wastewater or solar projects or wind projects or anything related to sustainable food or food waste, food deserts, any of those different concepts that your students are interested and passionate about, as you have the conversations with them, those are the outcomes that we want to focus on, and then present them the opportunity to develop those ideas and the solutions to meet those needs. And then also with this, we want to identify interventions. So what programs are available? What are available locally? What resources can we tap into? What's available internationally? And I challenge you all as international thought leaders to really always bring it back to this international perspective. Having the conversation, the impact is locally, and then having the conversation internationally about how it impacts differently in those two spheres of influence. So we talk a lot in our work with NASA, specifically the Mars rover team in NASA, and they talk about this idea of comparative planetology. So related to our solar eclipse we had yesterday, we'll talk about planets in space. This idea of comparative planetology, that we cannot truly understand Earth unless we understand other planets to compare it against. The same can be said for your community and tough challenges like climate education, where we cannot truly understand the impacts in our community unless we look at it from the lens of another community or another culture or another way of thinking or another way of living. So when I look at a problem here in Michigan, I like to talk to others in other states, in other regions, in other countries, in other ecosystems to really understand it from multiple perspectives. Really interesting conversation. I just had this last week. In the southern part of the United States, there's a lot of problems with wild boars or wild pigs. They're destroying crops, they cause damage, they cause all of these issues within these communities. And it's something that's very challenging because of this invasive species. I had the same conversation almost exactly with a group of educators in Indonesia. An animal was destroying their crops and impacting their communities and causing all kinds of problems. But it wasn't wild boars; it was wild elephants, or impacting this community in this way. So when you see this from a different perspective, you see the same things happening, the same impacts happening, but from a different perspective, may have different outcomes in those conversations. So I always like to look at lighthouses in this process, really talk about these kind of critical points of how we can interact with our teachers, with our communities through this progression. So I just wanted to give an example from Take Action Global and the way that we've kind of progressed over the number of years around this idea of different opportunities for our teachers, for our educational communities, and different examples. And all of these programs, are linked in our resources here today. So when we talk about this, we wanted to get progressive. So the same way I talk about policy to practice, I want to talk about very light touch programs, meaning having the least amount of interaction and the least amount of impact least amount of influence, I would say, on the teachers, to very intensive professional development, spending lots of time with teachers, bringing lots of resources to the classroom, into the idea of climate education in the classroom. So we've developed these different programs, kind of a progression or a systems level approach that are options. So when we talk about these different systems, the Climate Action Project has the highest volume of teachers and students. This last year, we are at 4.5 million teachers and students that participated worldwide in this program. And the idea behind this is basically we're trying to increase the conversation around climate education. We're providing some basic lessons every week for 6 weeks to teachers, completely free, teacher-centered, teacher interest-driven. Teachers sign up. They are invited into this community. We do this program in 17 languages in 160 countries across the world. Again, completely free, teacher-centered, and teacher-driven. So the idea is that we're doing foundation focused instructional resources, basically giving teachers the basic skills and basic resources to introduce climate into their classroom, into the current practices that they're doing in the teaching and learning program. So this is a basic overarching idea of climate education. We're really introducing this at a very light level so teachers can start this whole conversation in their classrooms and in their communities and around their professional environment, and really talk about how climate education can make an impact. Kind of jumping into the next progression, climate awareness is a program. We've done specific focused areas all over the world. Latest one was in New Jersey. We've done them in different countries all over the world, but we focus very specifically on that area. So we'll identify a group of districts or a group of schools or a group of educational leaders and really focus on a systems level approach. We try to reverse engineer what systems they're working on and how we can approach that to bring climate education into the classroom. So it supports a deeper integration of learning practices, of skills. So it's kind of this very general idea with the Climate Action Project. And now we're focusing it on the local idea through the Climate Awareness Program. And then the final one is a 10-month long, deep, intensive professional development program. So with this program, we limit it to 100 global schools. We choose all over the world. This last year, we were in 60 countries for 100 global schools, where we worked for 10 months straight, doing professional development, building identity, building this component to foster deep and systemic change within the teaching and learning practices across the board. So it's a different approach. And what we're seeing is a different progression that meets the needs of different areas. And this is not resource driven. This is not a prepackaged curriculum. It's the idea that we're working at the level of different schools' interests, different teachers' abilities, and really figuring out how we can best meet those learning communities' needs. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Climate Action Schools program, just to give you a general overview of what this looks like in practice. So when we dive deep into the intensive 10-month program, we kind of broke it down into what was necessary. Looking at the different programs, looking at the different teachers and the different communities around the world, and then also applying it to the different communities here in the United States, we broke it down into kind of these 5 categories. We wanted to ensure global collaboration. Just like I said before, doing the comparative planetology, I would call this comparative communities, looking community to community and how things impact those communities differently, depending on their needs, depending on their resources. All of those things are an important part of the conversation. We want to increase digital agency and action, giving students the ability to lead from the front, that they are in charge of their own learning practices. They are bringing about these skills and these resources and the different opportunities to take action in their communities. All of these things are very important in this learning process. As we see across the board in all content areas, project-based learning is always the most equitable and responsive form of education, where it really drives students' interest and it drives equity in the learning process, where students can meet their specific learning objectives through a variety of implications or a variety of methods. So we talk about equity, access, and inclusion, where we want learners of any type, of any background, of any opportunity to really come together to learn about a content area such as climate action, because what we find is those that are most impacted are often the least involved. So we want to involve these people, we want to involve these students and these learners in the communities. And finally, as with all programs, I would challenge in education as a whole, we want to recognize the learning that they're doing. We want to recognize the impact that they're having in their classrooms, in their communities, and across the board. So I'll leave this slide for you to review. I won't spend too much time on it today, but just walks through what we do in this 10-month program. So really it talks about this whole idea of progressive progressive learning and the slow release of responsibilities, where we're transitioning from us giving the information into you as the leader or the classroom educator or the community leader to really make the difference in your communities of practice and really interact in those ways. So the final piece that I wanted to really highlight here is talking about the human-centered design. Talking about the different components of human-centered design. And I won't spend too much time on the research around human-centered design, but wanted to really talk about some of the underlying issues. So one of the main tenets of human-centered design is addressing the core issue. So when we talk about human-centered design, we want to talk about implementing sustainability-focused instructional programs. How do we concentrate on essential aspects and underlying beliefs concerning sustainability within instructional programs? So what is the underlying component of sustainability education? Is it specifically climate? Is it specifically sustainability? Is it specifically community responsiveness? Or I would argue in a lot of ways, it's an opportunity to bring about really highly effective instructional processes where we can test skills, we can work with students in new and innovative ways, we can bring about new technologies. I know AI is very important right now, talking about how AI could be involved in the teaching and learning process, and all of those different components become extremely critical. So this is an opportunity to test proven instructional practices and how they can be effectively utilized in sustainable education. So it really addresses the core issues, the underlying issues of education. So I just worked with a district that has decided here in the United States that they're going to spend 50 days, 50 days on test prep this year by mandate to really address the issue of their test results. I'm not sure that that is addressing the core issue in the same way that we talk about when we talk about sustainability education. But I think as a reflection of student need, if we focus on the core skill building and really addressing those students' needs in the learning, we can engage in a much more effective learning outcome. The final piece here is talking about professional learning. So throughout non-core learning objectives, and what I mean by that in air quotes is it's not math, science, social studies, ELA, English language learning, English language arts, excuse me. Sustainability education can be really wrapped through all of those different components. But to be able to do that, we need to be able to find an objective and that is measurable, that we can look at how it's impacting education most effectively. But also being able to support those non-core teachers and saying, how do we make sure that they have the resources to meet those educational needs within their classrooms and communities? So if we can measure the impact of a program in other core subject areas, student development and community engagement may be the mechanism for that change. So really looking at things in different ways. How do we meet those needs and those expectations most effectively for our classrooms and our communities? So when we talk about professional learning, we need to make sure that we are supporting our teachers, supporting the outcomes of those conversations, and making sure that they are resourced and skilled in those conversations, because we are not testing it on a standardized test, because we are not testing sustainability through standards means. that we see other core subject areas being tested. We need to spend more time developing teachers' skills, resources, and foundational understanding to make sure that we're meeting those needs most effectively. So as I wrap up, and I would love to go to questions, I just wanted to be sure that you have the resources here in front of you. So all of these are links to all of the different components that we pulled all of our information from today in the development of this and other presentations. Be happy to have conversations with you today or offline. Happy to connect. But please feel free to reach out. My contact information is on the slide deck, and we'll make sure that it's shared out with all of the things that we send out today. I just wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank you for having these discussions and being involved in these discussions. And this is a challenge that we do at TAG, is imagine a world in which young people across 7 continents connect virtually and solve one of the world's most pressing challenges, climate change.
Thank you, Riley. And we're sorry we missed Lauren.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. As Riley said, do not hesitate to contact, any of them. This was a joint presentation from Take Action Global and Save the Children. So it's very rich in data. We have several questions, Riley, in the Q&A, which is great. And I wonder, maybe we can take all of them at the same time. How do we work with and around the ground reality where teachers are overburdened and under-resourced? Do we know private sector innovators, entrepreneurs doing work in low carbon technology? And then storytelling, which you mentioned at the beginning. And then Arwa has a question about the 10-month program. How do you measure the impact on the environment aspects?
Yeah, so this is something that we have consistently struggled with as an organization, and I think we will all struggle with this as we measure these impacts. So we do it a couple different ways. Obviously, the qualitative way, where we take surveys, we have conversations, we do case studies, all of those different pieces measuring impact in our school communities. But the other component is we wanted a quantitative method and a quantitative approach. So we actually worked with another organization to develop an app. It's completely free. It's available for you and your communities and your schools. It's called the Earth Project app, and it's linked in there. But basically what it does is allows students to put in their decisions that they make to measure carbon offset. So if they ride their bike or ride the bus or walk to school, and they put that decision in for that day, it will measure the carbon that they used or did not use. And then they can actually do it as a challenge within their classroom, within their community, within their class or their family, and actually look at what kind of carbon offset they're having. So we look at that really as the statistical or quantitative side, but then the qualitative side is very much interview focused or survey focused and measuring impact through that as well. The other component is we measure actions. So we calculate the number of actions students are physically taking, and those actions may be planting trees, they may be hosting webinars, they may be signing petitions. What actions are students physically taking? Because when we're talking about climate action education, the action component becomes central, that we're not just measuring the ideas or the theory, we're actually measuring what is being done.
Thank you, Ragney. I also have a question. Often teachers are not free to do what they want. And if, they cannot come up with a curriculum themselves, they cannot come up with the content themselves. And that's in the global, outside of the United States, different policies in shape. How do you deal with that in your international work?
So a lot of it we focus on, all of our work focuses on the instructional practice, the pedagogy side of instruction. Education around climate and sustainability is just the mechanism or the lens through which we do those developments. Specifically internationally, we focus on high quality teaching and learning practices, skill development for teachers and for students, and we do it through climate concepts. So it's not kind of skirting the issue, but it is in the sense of we're trying to focus very much on the instructional process and instructional skill building, and then using a concept that is global, like climate, allows us to really do that in a more effective way. Because when we're talking about, these concepts of deeper thinking and concepts of independent project development and some of these different pieces in these instructional processes, it only really makes sense to think about an international lens, because we are a more international community at this point. We're working in an international learning community. And that's the one thing I will say that's positive that came from the pandemic, is now the globalization of learning has become much more effective. We can have more conversations in a global community around that practice.
Thank you, Riley. I will ask if we can have the link to the application that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
it's I'll type it in the chat here. It's Earth.
Great. And we'll also put it on the website so you have access to it. Thank you. And one last question that comes from me, and then we'll end 10 minutes before the hour. My question. Oh, I just forgot what my question was. Oh, it was a good one though. Oh my goodness, I cannot believe that. Oh yeah, no, terminology. Thank you.
Mhm.
So that's how you opened the discussion. What did you settle on at Take Action Global and Save the Children, or what's, and talking about globalization of learning, what do you recommend that
So it's difficult, so it's difficult to say that one answer is the right answer, specifically when you talk about terminology or definitions, those different components. But what we always push towards is not sustainability education, because I feel like it's too general. We talk specifically about climate action education, and try to really push the action component. And that's something specifically from Take Action Global. It's in our name. But also looking at this as sustainable practices can really be taught across the board. So when we're talking about climate education, we're talking about climate action education, those are a little bit different, but climate education and sustainability education are very, very similar in that process. So it's really not necessarily even in the global community we need to define it. It's locally we need to make sure that we have defined the learning outcomes and the processes for that in our community. So when you're having the conversation on the street corner or with a community leader or with your principal or with your teacher or with your parents, everybody knows what you're talking about. Globally, I think we can handle that, but I think locally is the more important conversation to make sure that they're aligned.
Thank you. And that's the challenge, right? Because someone will come up with a nationally, accepted terminology that no one understands in at the school level. So thank you. I mean, this was just incredible. I told you all, go to meet Riley and his amazing experience. So we got it all. Thank you so much. We will the meeting was recorded. You'll have access to it. You can share it. It was great. We'll put it on the website. And guess what? We're going to have another thought leadership webinar. I don't know if Riley, do you want to quickly touch on that?
Yes, absolutely. So our next thought leadership webinar is going to be more of a panel discussion. Hopefully everybody will be back to be feeling good. We're going to be bringing in some different leaders around this idea of setting policy and bringing about climate action in legislation. So the legislative end of it, and how do we do this at the state level specifically, but also at the national government level. So we'll be having more of a panel conversation around our experiences and practices and what has been the outcome of that over the last number of years.
Thank you, Riley. So please, you all who are here today, amplify the link when it comes out. Ask the policymakers that you know of to participate, because this will influence them or get them to think, which is what we all want. So thank you again for everything. Thank you, Riley. It was a great presentation. We learned a lot. I did. And stay tuned for the next webinar. Thank you so
you.
much. Have a great,
Thank you,
great rest
everyone.
of the day. Thank you,
Have a nice
everyone.
day.
Bye. Bye.